Hello and welcome to our first food science lecture. I am really excited about this class. For those of you who don't know me yet, I'm Dr. Shannon Cruzen. You can call me Mrs. Cruzen or Miss Shannon too. I'm not real particular about the doctor, but doctor's fine too if you want to do that. But I'm particularly excited about this class because this is my subject area. I do have a PhD, hence the doctor, and my PhD was in meat science, which is a division of food science. And I was also a certified food scientist in my career, and I worked for a food company, Smithfield Foods, for several years before I decided to switch my career to being a stay-at-home homeschool mom. So I am super excited to share with you my knowledge this year, and some of that will probably convey when we're doing some of these subjects. So the first chapter, let me backtrack a little bit. So the way we're going to do this is we don't really have time for a lecture at all during our classes. We're going to be jam-packed full of lab activities during our time at co-op, and I wanted to give you a little bit more than what's just in the book. And especially there are some aspects of this book that is outdated. It's a good book, but I specifically chose an older version of it to help save your parents a lot of money, because the current version is about $150 and we were able to get the old version for less than $30. And that's not even counting the lab notebook. So the lab notebook is cheaper using this old version too. So there are some things in here that are a little bit outdated, some things that, given my knowledge of the field, I can expound on and hopefully add some interest. And so I wanted to still be able to do a lecture with you guys, but we don't have the time in co-op. So instead, each week I'm going to provide a video lecture for you to watch. For some chapters, we'll be taking 2 weeks to cover the entire chapter. For others that I don't feel are quite as important, where I feel like I need 2 weeks to cover all the material, we'll breeze through those quicker in 1 week. So chapter 1 is a 1-week chapter. It's just an overview of what food science is and some of the history of food science. So let's get started. What is food science? Okay, so this definition is coming straight from the book. I've just broken it down a little bit. So it's the study of the nature of food, causes of deterioration, principles underlying food processing, and the improvement of foods for the consuming public. So let's break those down. So nature of food. I've shown an example of an apple going all the way through for each of these aspects of food science. So what is an apple? What is it made of? What are the chemical constituents of an apple? The acidity, the sugar, what other chemicals are part of an apple? All right, an apple has something called pectin, which we'll learn about later in the year. That is used for that is a property that we can take advantage of to create other products. All right, so the nature of food is studying all of those things, like from the big picture to the microscopic, and even like the chemistry of the food, and understanding that, because all of that goes into the rest of it. Okay, so the study of deterioration, the causes of deterioration. So in this example of the picture, I show spoilage, an apple spoiling and rotting. But we could also talk about other forms of deterioration, things going stale, an apple browning, for example, pathogens, right? one of the things that we'll learn is that food that will make you sick, it doesn't necessarily look like it will make you sick. So meat that could make you very, very, very ill potentially, and probably would, smell and look perfectly fine because it's a different kind of bacteria that causes spoilage versus pathogenicity, or the ability to make you sick. Other things is what if we added an acid to a food? How would that break down the product in a way that we like or don't like? So those would all fall under causes of deterioration, not just necessarily spoilage. Then the principles underlying food processing. So this is taking a lot of the nature of food and using it to prevent some of the deterioration of food in many cases, or just taking something about the nature of food and using it to make something completely different. And understanding how ingredients interact with each other to form different foods, to how we can use all of these attributes about food to create something. All right. And then finally, improvement of foods for the consuming public. So this is one that, especially when food science college students, this is the one they focus on. This is product development, right? This is, okay, I know how to make applesauce, and now I'm going to figure out how I can produce this applesauce in a way that adds value to a consumer versus them just making it themselves, right? So the squeezable applesauce are a great example of that. It's taking another aspect of food science that would probably go under principles of underlying food processing, packaging, and using that packaging to create something that is very novel, or at least was at the time that these things were first introduced. And now you see them all over the place. Okay. So now we're going to go into some of the history of food science, and I really find a lot of this fascinating. And so I'm going to add a few things in here that the book doesn't cover, because I think a lot of the history of food science is really cool. So the book breaks down the history of food science into 3 periods. And so we're going to go ahead and keep with that and go through those 3 periods. Okay, the first period is the period of early food discoveries. Okay, and this is where people, like a long time ago, were figuring out what is safe to eat. All right, so through a process of elimination, trying something, getting sick, realizing, oh, that wasn't good. And so gaining that knowledge throughout humankind of what foods are actually safe for us to eat. Then, where is food most plentiful? So then learning where can we get the food, because we need to live in a place where that food is most plentiful. And so that's where you saw people that were where people were living closer to rivers, where there was plenty of rainfall, good soil, not necessarily choosing to live in mountainous areas, etc. And so trying to find where food was the most plentiful. Okay, from there, people learned how to grow their food. So how do we take this that was growing in the wild and domesticate it in a way to where we can actually grow it where we're living. We don't have to go and forage for it. And so from there, they took foods that were the easiest to grow. So some foods were great for foraging, but weren't necessarily the easiest to grow where the people were close to where the people were living in a crop type situation. Um, from there, they um, d- adapted those foods. They chose the best of a certain crop or animal and used husbandry to improve the lines. So the animals, for example, of back in biblical times, yes, same animals, but they looked very different than today because those animals over time have been bred to be bigger, more muscular, so therefore have more meat in a lot of cases, be more efficient with how they convert what they eat into muscle. Um, and so this is all just people learning as they went in these early food discoveries period. Then how can we make food last longer? So for example, drying the food. Um, People discovered that that made food last much longer. It wouldn't spoil once it was dried. Salting is another way to dry the food. Or well, you often use salting in combination with drying, and it does dry it out. It does pull the water out. Okay, so here's an example of both drying and salting is a ham. So you would pack that ham in salt and then set it out to dry, and then you have a ham that lasts months rather than days. And this was really important because there were times of plenty and times of famine and hard times. And so being able, learning how to store this food um, would extend the times that people had food available. Okay, grain's another example. The grain is dried before it was stored, and people learned that very early on. Okay, another example is smoking, which could also be done in conjunction with this ham. So smoke has many compounds in it that are preservative and antibacterial and keep food from spoiling. And so these were some of the earliest methods of food preservation. Right? People also discovered that cooking gives desirable attributes also. Completely different flavors. It also does extend the shelf life because you have killed bacteria. Um, but people during the early food discovery period discovered that cooking was a way to prevent illness, make food last longer, and it tasted pretty good. And of course, there were a lot of accidental discoveries, and some of these other ones I've already listed may have also been accidental discoveries, but some really well thought of accidental discoveries. We don't really have proof of any of these because a lot of this there's no historical record of these things being discovered, but we can definitely speculate that it probably was an accident that some of these were discovered. So the one that the book discusses is cheese. So, how cheese was probably discovered is that people would carry their milk, their liquid, in animal skins, but often animal stomachs that were turned into a little cask thing that you could carry the liquid in. So they take that animal's stomach, they would sew up one side of it, and then they'd have the opening up at the top that they could put the liquid into. Okay, so maybe some shepherd someday had one of these and they put the sheep milk into it, and probably these these casks that held the liquid, they were usually cleaned out before they were used to carry those liquid, but maybe one wasn't cleaned out very well. Okay, and ruminant stomachs. So ruminants are animals that chew their cud, basically, and so sheep and cows would be the big ones. Ruminant stomachs, especially the stomachs of young ruminants that are still drinking milk, have an enzyme called rennet in them. Okay, and that for the young animal is a compound that helps for the digestion of milk. All right, it curdles the milk and eases the digestion in the stomach of that animal. Okay, so what probably happened here is that they have this animal stomach that they're using to carry around the milk. It hasn't been cleaned out quite all the way. There's still a little bit of rennet left in there, and they're jostling it around as they're walking, and then they open it up and there's chunks in it, right? It's not just milk anymore. And they discover these chunks actually taste pretty good because they're little pieces of cheese. And from there, they're like, what caused this? Well, it was something about this stomach that I'm carrying around, and from there they tried things, they developed the process, and they realized that it was the stomach of the young animals. And so this picture on the bottom right here is of an actual sheep stomach, I believe, that today, like some farmer that's using old methods would put the milk into that and shake it around and agitate it and until they turn it into cheese. And so then, and this is actually something that could be sold today as more of a niche thing. But this is originally how cheese was made. Now, most cheese today is not made with animal rennet. It's not made from the enzyme that is taken from the stomach of a calf or a sheep. There's a vegetable form of rennet that has been discovered, and that is used. And also, if cheese is made with animal rennet, usually it's going to be processed out of the lining of the stomach and used kind of separately. It's not going to be the cheese is not going to be made in the animal stomach anymore. Okay. Some other accidental discoveries, though, include wine, most likely. So somebody had some grapes and they left them sitting out and it fermented and they drank it and, this is actually pretty good. And it's safer. Like back in biblical times, the wine was safer to drink than the water was in a lot of cases. And the reason why is because that fermentation created the alcohol, and alcohol killed off bacteria, which could be found in bad sources of water back in those days. And so wine was drank quite a bit then. Cured meat was also probably an accidental discovery. So what I mean by cured meat is a ham. The fact that it is cooked but it is pink, it is cured. And that is caused by a chemical compound called sodium nitrite. And most likely the process of curing was a little bit of an accident because people were salting their meat and nitrite was in the salt as a contaminant. You can find some nitrite in sea salt, for example. And so they were inadvertently adding bits of nitrite to their meat and it came out pink. But we don't just cure things because they come out pink. It extends the shelf life. It makes the meat safer. Nitrite kills a lot of bad pathogens. And that curing process also provides some flavor attributes. And so all in all, they're like, oh, this is great. And happy accident. And then they learn, like, how did this happen? And from there, food product development proceeds, and we start purposely making cheese and wine and curing meat. Okay, so the second period that the book talks about in the development of food is the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and so in this Industrial Revolution, the key thing that was happening here is that we started understanding the why of how food preservation methods worked. We knew that, adding this salt, this sodium nitrate salt, cured the meat and made it safer and tastier, and also did this pink color. But why did it work? For example, why does cooking make food safer, etc.? Okay, and a lot of this was due to the improvements that were made in the microscope. So now, all of a sudden, people could look through the microscope and they could see bacteria. Whereas before this was totally foreign concept, and most people would have been laughed out of their country if they tried to tell you that illness was caused by microscopic organisms. Okay, and so because we saw improvements in the microscope, there was a greater understanding of food microbiology and how that affects food safety. We also saw the advent of canning, which was kind of related, because canning uses really high heat, and a hermetically sealed container that keeps the food lasting longer without it necessarily needing to be super salty or dry. Okay. During this time, Louis Pasteur was also around, and Louis Pasteur was a French chemist. He was a pharmacist. He was a microbiologist. He made discoveries in vaccination, but in food science, we are more concerned with, he discovered a lot of things about microbial fermentation and how that works, as well as pasteurization. So when we think about pasteurization today, a lot of times we're thinking about milk pasteurization, for example. And so he made that discovery, and we call it pasteurization because of Louis Pasteur. He made this discovery that we could heat these items to a certain level and extend their shelf life, but also make them safer, because at the level that we call pasteurization, it's specifically meant to kill pathogens, organisms that make you sick. Okay. So he is often called the father of microbiology or the father of bacteriology. There's a couple other guys that also are sometimes given that name, but he is a big one. During this time was also the advent of steam engines and machinery. So as far as steam engines, we saw the rail car being invented. And so now food could travel much longer from place to place, much further from place to place. We also saw farm equipment being invented, so new methods of harvesting, and therefore greater ways or greater amounts of harvest able to be done. Bigger farms were able to occur, and the advent of factory equipment. So now not everything had to be done completely by hand, and you saw things like, for example, in the meat industry, the like carcasses, even today, are hung on rails and are brought through the plant in that way. Now at that time, it was a little bit less mechanized than it is today. They used a lot of things like gravity to get that to happen well, but we saw a lot of advent of equipment, and all of this made. So here, this picture here is of a rail car that was carrying canned meats from Armour. So Armour was one of the big companies that showed up in this time. Pillsbury is another. Campbell's is another. And it says beefsteak. That's beefsteak tomatoes. So they were still making soup at that time. And so we saw the advent of a lot of more processed foods than had been seen at any time before that, because now we had this abundance of food that could be carried into one spot with the rail cars. We had the factory equipment that could be used to very efficiently combine ingredients together. We had the knowledge of things like canning to make that food safer and last longer. And then we had the rail cars on the back end to get it to the consumer. And so we have lots of mass-produced ingredients. I believe the book gives an example of baking powder for one. We saw the rise of convenience foods. So the book talks about pancake mix coming to the forefront as an example. So starting in around World War II, women started working more outside of the home when their men were off fighting the war, and that trend kind of continued even after the men came back. And now we needed food that we could cook quickly for our families, and things like the Aunt Jemima's pancake mix fit the bill. And so really in the Industrial Revolution, we started to see the advent of kind of modern day food processing. Okay, and then the third period is the government regulation of food, of the food industry. So unfortunately, with the coming of mass food production and this bigger food economy where food could travel hundreds of miles from place to place, this brought adulteration. And so adulteration is the action of making something poorer in quality or safety by adding another substance. Okay, so typically when we're talking about adulteration, a lot of it is purposeful. It can sometimes be an accident. That a lot of times we call that more like a contaminant. But there was a lot of purposeful food adulteration that started happening in this time. So this period in the development of food, it actually does overlap just a little bit with the previous period, with the industrial age. So some of this industrial age things that were going on starts bringing about the government regulation. Okay, but now adulteration had always happened, even probably back in biblical times, but it really became more of the norm rather than the exception. But the good thing was that because we'd just been through the Industrial Revolution, scientists now had a greater ability to detect it. They could look at it with a microscope. They had learned a lot of chemical techniques to detect things. The science was much more advanced than it had been in the distant historical past. So that was really good because there became a way to detect it and be like, okay, we need to control this. So I want to show you this video. This is actually a current video. There are some parts of the world still today that have problems with food adulteration. This video is out of an agency in India, and they're showing how you can detect the presence of, I believe, clay in coffee. So play this.
Is your coffee powder adulterated with clay? Let's do a simple test. Take a glass of water. Add half a teaspoon of coffee powder in the glass. Wait for 5 minutes. The unadulterated coffee will have no sediments at the bottom of the glass. The adulterated coffee will have sediments at the bottom of the glass.
Okay, so that is just one example of current adulteration that happens today. Another example would be honey. I need to go to the next slide. Is it not going? Hold on. Okay. Another example today would be honey. So honey adulteration is a big problem today, especially honey coming from China. They see a lot of corn syrup mixed into it because corn syrup is obviously going to be much cheaper than honey, and so there's a lot of testing that goes on imported honey to try to prevent some of that adulterated honey from coming into the U.S. Okay, so all right. So now in the late 1800s, let me go back a little bit. By the late 1800s, Great Britain had already developed their own law to help prevent adulteration. But the U.S. was not quite there yet. To be completely honest with you, the big food industry had really made their influence on the government and prevented laws and things from happening so that would regulate them. Okay. However, in 1904, Upton Sinclair wrote The Jungle. And I have 1904 to 1906 because it wasn't until 1906 that the book was published in a way that it really got to the public. So effectively 1906 it was really published. And this book brought public attention to all forms of adulteration, but specifically in the meat industry. So Mr. Sinclair was actually trying to bring attention to the worker conditions in the meat industry. So you can see in this picture here on the right, there are children working, but not only that, it was unsanitary, it was the workers were treated extremely poorly. They had worked super long hours, paid very little, could barely survive. And he saw this and wanted to bring attention to it. Here's another picture from the meat industry at that time. You can see, like, looking at like how close that meat is to the floor and what that floor looks like. It doesn't look like a very sanitary condition. Okay. But he wasn't as successful in his actual goal, and it's partly because he was a very good writer and describer of the things that he was writing about. He actually worked as a worker in the meat industry just for research and on his book. So a lot of this it's firsthand turned into fiction. So I'm going to read a couple passages from here, and you'll see what I mean. So the meat would be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat, even when he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poisoned rat was a tidbit. There was no place for the men to wash their hands before they ate their dinner, and so they made a practice of washing them in the water that was to be ladled into the sausage. There were the butt ends of smoked meats and the scraps of corned beef and all the odds and ends of the waste of the plants that would be dumped into old barrels in the cellar and left there. Under the system of rigid economy which the packers enforced, there were some jobs that it only paid to do once in a long time, and among these was the cleaning out of the waste barrels. Every spring they did it, and in the barrels would be dirt and rust and old nails and stale water, and cartload after cartload of it would be taken up and dumped into the hoppers with fresh meat and sent out to the public's breakfast. Yummy. Okay. Another passage. All day long the blazing midsummer sun beat down upon that square mile of abominations, upon tens of thousands of cattle crowded into pens whose wooden floors stank and steamed contagion, upon bare, blistering, cinder-strewn railroad tracks and huge blocks of dingy meat factories whose labyrinthine passages defied a breath of fresh air to penetrate them. And there were not merely rivers of hot blood, and carloads of moist flesh, and rendering vats and soap cauldrons, glue factories, and fertilizer tanks that smelt like the craters of hell. There were also tons of garbage festering in the sun, and the greasy laundry of the workers hung out to dry, and dining rooms littered with food and black with flies, and toilet rooms that were open sewers. So the second passage, you can really see what he was really trying to get at. The second passage is just gross too, but like think about being a worker in these conditions. It was not good. So one of Upton Sinclair's famous quotes was, "I aimed at the public's heart and trying to get it right, and by accident hit it in the stomach." So he was really trying to hit on the worker conditions, and he's actually pushing for socialism in his book. But by accident, the focus, once the public read this book, was on the food, and there was mass outrage, and something had to be done. Okay, so Teddy Roosevelt was the president at this time, and so this is a comic from this time, and you can see that he is dealing with this meat scandal and pushing for an investigation that into what exactly was going on. And as a result of all of that, we got two very important laws. Very important. Okay, and they happened pretty much at the same time. So the first is the Pure Food and Drug Act, which is also known as the Wiley Act, because Wiley was the head of the department that developed this act, and ended up being the head of the FDA, I believe. This act established the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration. It also prohibited the interstate commerce of misbranded, so like wrongly labeled or adulterated food, drinks, or drugs. Okay. Okay, the second act that occurred this same year was the Meat Inspection Act. So these things occurred really quick after the Jungle was published. That was the outrage that happened. So the Meat Inspection Act basically did the same thing, but for meat. So the FDA controls pretty much everything food-wise except for meat, poultry, and eggs. And the USDA does those. So the USDA had already been established at this point, the U.S. Department of Agriculture, but this act gave them inspection authority for any products, meat, and I think eggs actually came later. At this time, it was just meat, that were going to be interstate commerce. Now, this is a thing. The key thing is that both of these regulated interstate commerce. So that's commerce that is products being sold that are going to cross state lines. Okay. Okay, so continuing on from there, I'm not going to go over every single regulation that is in the book, but these are the ones that I think are important. Okay, so 1938, we had the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and that basically just expanded the Pure Food and Drug Act from 1906 to include cosmetics. Okay, and it gave the FDA the authority to establish regulations and guidelines. So before that, the FDA did not have that authority, and with the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, they now have the authority to start establishing their own regulations and guidelines. Okay, in 1958 there was the Food Additives Amendment, and so that required the safety of new additives to be established before using. And so with that, there was a GRAS list. GRAS stands for Generally Recognized as Safe, and that is still used today. There is lists of ingredients that are considered GRAS, generally recognized as safe, and they've all had safety reviews before they go onto that list. Okay. In 1958, we also had the Delaney Clause, which is a clause to the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act that prohibits any food additive that is known to cause cancer. In 1966, we got a law that started regulating packaging and labeling. So we have the Fair Packaging and Labeling Act requiring all consumer products that are, again, in interstate commerce to be honestly and informatively labeled. Okay. Then in 1967, we finally got a law that said something about intrastate commerce. This is the Wholesome Meat Act, so it only applied to meat, and then a year or two later, poultry was added, saying that the state meat inspection must be equal to or better than federal inspection. Okay, so product that is made in the state of Texas must have their own inspectors, even if it's not going to be sold outside of Texas. So if it's sold outside of Texas, a federal inspector has to inspect your plant. But if it's only sold within the state of Texas, you will have a state inspector. And whatever inspection that they're performing has to be equal to or better than federal inspection. Now, I will say the FDA does not have a similar law that I know of, but there is an expectation, and the states do follow it, that their rules have to be equal to or better than the federal rules. I'll also add here, so if any of you are familiar at all with like custom slaughter, so like if you are having somebody come to your farm and slaughter your goat or cow or whatever, and they like do that on site and then give you directly the meat, where you're just only paying for the slaughter procedure, and the meat remains yours through that whole interaction. Inspection is not actually required. The same goes for if you take it to them. I said if they come to you, but so places where, like for example, deer, if you have a deer that you're going to get processed, that falls under custom slaughter, and they don't actually have to have inspection. Just FYI. Okay. So 1990, jumping a few decades ahead, was the Nutrition Labeling Education Act. So that is where we got our nutrition labels that are on all our foods. That's when it was first regulated, that all packaged foods have to have nutrition labeling, and health claims must be verified and consistent. Now, 1992 to 1993 is an important year in history of the U.S. for food safety. So in that time, Jack in the Box had a incident or major incident of it's an outbreak where multiple people got sick, but specifically children. So it was Jack in the Box locations in California, Idaho, Washington, and Nevada. Um, in this outbreak, it was E. coli 0157H7, and 4 children died. And in addition to that, 178 children, I believe it's all children, but they may just be 178 people, but 178 others were left with permanent injury that they live with for the rest of their lives. So, it gets me emotional, but anyways, so this was really important because people realized that something needed to be changed, that the inspection that was happening was not enough, that we needed to do something to prevent this type of thing from happening and not just react after the fact, because E. coli 0157H7 is invisible. So just regular inspection was not going to prevent this. Okay, so as a reaction to this, largely as a reaction to this event, in 1996, this is specifically for the meat industry, a final rule on pathogen reduction and HACCP, which stands for Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. This whole final rule is often called the Pathogen Reduction Act. It required this HACCP system in the meat and poultry industry. So this is a preventative system for identifying and controlling hazards that could cause illness or injury. Okay, and so this became mandatory in the meat industry in the United States starting in 1996. We'll learn a lot more about HACCP when we get to our food safety chapters, and you'll even start developing your own HACCP plan for your food product development projects, but really important. Okay, now in 2004, so skipping away from food safety for a minute, we had the Food Allergy Labeling and Consumer Protection Act. So that act required allergy labeling for all of the big 8 allergens: fish, shellfish, wheat, dairy, eggs, peanuts, tree nuts, and soy. And I believe now sesame might have been added since then. And so if you have any of these allergens in your food product, it must be on the label, very clear, contains soy, etc. And I'm sure you've seen that on ingredient labels before, and if you haven't, you should look. Finally, gosh, how many years later? From 1996 to 2011, so 15 years later, the FDA got with the program, and they had the Food Safety Modernization Act. And so finally, 15 years later, after the meat industry, the FDA caught up and started requiring HACCP themselves. Also, before 2011, the FDA did not have mandatory recall authority. They couldn't say, you must recall this product because we know there's something wrong with it. They could just advise that, hey, you should probably do this. And so now they have mandatory recall authority, and they also increased FDA inspections. So unlike the USDA and meat plants, FDA inspectors do not have to be in FDA food plants 100% of the time that product is being made. In the meat industry, they do. So this was an effort to increase that. They still are not in their food plants 100% of the time, all the time, unlike the meat industry. Meat industry, you can't even sell your product unless there's an inspector there when you're making it. Now this 2011, it came about also because an event. It's kind of sad that is what advances food safety, but it does. So in 2011, this probably the biggest event that caused this to start get rolling, and it just took a while for it to go into effect. But 2007 there was, and some of y'all might remember this. How old would y'all be? I don't know. But there was an outbreak in peanut butter, Peter Pan peanut butter, and no one died in this one because it was salmonella and not E. coli 0157H7. So salmonella is not quite as dangerous, but 425 people in 46 states got sick. And so that, in addition to a lot of other well-publicized outbreaks, particularly in spinach, I think around that time, really caused Congress to say, hey, we've got to do something to up the game of the FDA and catch them up a little bit with the meat industry. Okay. Unfortunately, the compliance dates for the Food Safety Modernization Act didn't take effect until 2016. And this one might be one more that you remember. Yeah, because the Peter Pan one, y'all would have been babies if you were born. But this one you might remember, 2015, was the Bluebell Listeria outbreak. And that actually happened before FSMA, which is the Food Safety Modernization Act, took effect. So even though the act was in 2011, they had to give plants time to get all of their processes up to date and get their HACCP programs in place. And Bluebell didn't have it in place yet. So 2015, the Bluebell Listeria outbreak happened and 3 people died. But now everybody is on board with HACCP. Okay, so touch on some government regulation today. As I said, USDA is in charge of meat, poultry, and processed egg products, and the FDA is in charge of all other foods, drugs, and cosmetics. Okay. The book also mentions the food code. This food code contains all the FDA recommendations and regulations for safe food handling, and so this is something, it provides a uniform standard that any entity can use. So specifically, things like hotels, restaurants, grocery stores are going to be using this food code and generally must be following it to a lot of the states refer to their food code for their regulations. So they must be following it for safe food handling. And this is updated every 4 years to make sure that all the scientific information that we have on that is up to date. Okay. The book also touches a little bit on certified organic products. So certified organic is a USDA marketing term. So even though a food is not meat, the USDA controls this part of it, the marketing part. So inspection, USDA is only in charge of meat, poultry, eggs, but marketing is a different story. And so this is a marketing term, not an inspection term, not a food safety term. Okay, so it's quality, not safety. So there are several different labels that can be put on things, and so each of them have kind of increasing, decreasing, how organic does something have to be. So 100% organic means the food contains only organic ingredients, not including water and salt. Water and salt are not organic because they don't have carbon. But we allow both of those things to be in an organic product. So if it's labeled simply organic, that means the food contains at least 95% organic ingredients. And if it says made with organic ingredients or foods, that means that must contain at least 70% organic ingredients. Okay, so it's kind of like a good consumer knowledge thing to know is what those different levels of things mean, because I mean at least 70% organic ingredients could be not really that organic at all if you're really trying to go after that. Okay, so all organic labels on crops, so like I'm saying, everything including the 100% organic, made with organic ingredients or food. Okay, so if you're talking about the crop itself, that means it has undergone no irradiation. It has no sewage sludge has been used on it, no synthetic fertilizers, and no prohibited pesticides can be used, and GMOs cannot be included on an organic label. The sewage sludge, I honestly don't know why that would ever be used. I don't think it really is, but yeah. When it comes to meat, an organic label means that no antibiotics were used on the animal, no growth hormones were administered. They've only been given organic feed. They've been given access to the outdoors, and all the welfare standards have been met to qualify. Okay, so what do food scientists do? Okay, we've touched on this a little bit, but some of the different things that food scientists do. Understanding the biology and chemistry of foods and processes used to improve and preserve them. So this is kind of a very broad definition there. And different food scientists do different parts of this too. So identifying nutrients, linking food and health. Now food nutrition is almost its own, well, a lot of these things, its own category, own degree. Food nutritionists are food scientists, but they have a very, very different specialization. Develop new products. That's kind of one of the more common thinking things that people think food scientists do. Develop new safety measures and monitors the safety of food production. So a lot of food scientists are purely concerned about the food safety. That was part of my job a little bit. I focused a little bit more on the next one when I worked in the food industry. Ensuring quality control processes are followed so that the best possible product can be produced. Analyzing food. So did we meet our specifications? Does it have the correct levels of salt, moisture, etc.? Developing new efficient ways of producing food. Developing new food preservation and packaging methods. So some important contributions that have occurred in like more recent history of food science. This one, honestly, I'd never heard of this, but I'm going over it because the book goes over it. So Encaparina. And this is a good example of things that, like, something that food scientists would do, okay? So it's a cereal, like a breakfast cereal, or probably more like oatmeal kind of thing, that's made with maize, sorghum, and cottonseed flour, okay? I looked this up, and this picture is, like, I think you can buy it at Walmart. It's actually, now at least, it's only made with corn and soy. So maybe it used to be made with maize, sorghum, and cottonseed flour, but now it's made with corn and soy. It was developed in the 1960s and sold specifically in Guatemala. Okay, and the goal was to help kids get nutrients that they weren't necessarily getting with their current diets. So it's 21% protein, which is really pretty high in protein. I mean, that's about the same amount percent of protein as is in meat. And it's also high in many vitamins. So the goal for this product was to really help kids get the nutrients that they needed that maybe they weren't getting from other sources. Okay, amaranth. This is really a current one. It's one that people are still looking at today, even though this book was written, several years ago. So amaranth is an ancient seed plant. It's indigenous to Central America, and it was originally grown by the Aztecs and the Maya. And the interesting thing that I learned looking into this for this slideshow was that when the Europeans came and took over, they actually banned the native people from growing this anymore, and they would still kind of grow it in secret as an act of defiance. And so even today, the people in Central America growing it feel defiant when they grow it. So it was really interesting, and it was because they connected a lot of their religious things to this plant. But anyways, it's a complete protein. This seed is high in many vitamins and minerals. So by being a complete protein, we'll learn more about that in the protein chapter. but it has all the essential amino acids, which is very rare in a plant-based food, to get it from one seed, and not having to source from several different plant-based foods to get the right combination of essential amino acids. So it's high in many vitamins and minerals, and it's high in fiber. So it's really a really good food. It's also really easy to grow. I actually have some of this, not for food, but I have some of this in as a potted plant, and it jumps like 6 feet because the seeds blow and starts growing in my other potted plants. Like, it's kind of a weed in a lot of ways. So it's very, very easy to grow, and it's drought resistant. Like, I can almost kill it and then I give it water and it pops right back up. So it does have some great potential to be something that could be used to feed people in food insecure areas. Okay. Hydroponic crops is another one that the book talks about. So hydroponic crops are crops that are grown with roots suspended in liquid nutrient solutions. And yeah, I'm sure like you've probably eaten hydroponic strawberries before, and they're pretty good. And it's a very efficient way of producing these, because you don't have to worry about other weeds, and then there's less potential for pests living in the soil and things like that. Also, there's biotechnology. So when we're talking about biotechnology, we're usually talking about genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. So these crops in particular are bred for things like, or are modified for things like insect resistance, herbicide resistance. I see my spelling error there. For higher yields and potentially other qualities. And really, like, to be fair to the industry, like, yes, there is money to be made by able to produce more crops, but this is also about feeding the world, because the population of the world keeps increasing, and if we don't find ways to be more efficient and produce more on less land, then we will run into a problem at some point soon with not being able to produce enough food. And to date, if we still produced food with the same methods that were used 200 years ago, we wouldn't be able to feed the people that are on this earth now. So there is something positive to be said for what is going on with genetically modified organisms. Now, I'm not going to get into it right now with the concerns that people have, but there is something positive. Okay, so looking at these pictures, there are apples called Arctic apples that they've done the modification in several different varieties. I think this picture here is Granny Smith, and they don't brown. So you have less waste because kids aren't throwing them away because they turn brown. So currently 94% of soybean crops are GMOs. 96% of cotton is GMO. So for soybeans, it's mostly about herbicide resistance, so they can spray Roundup and kill everything else. It increases their yield because they're not fighting against other weeds. For cotton, that modification is resistance to boll weevils. And boll weevils are really, really destructive. And the GMO crop has pretty much saved the cotton industry in a lot of areas in the U.S. Corn, about 92% of corn is GMO. Most of the GMO corn is field corn, which is used for feed for livestock. Canola, which is where we get canola oil, 95% of that is GMO. It's herbicide resistant. Sugar beets, nearly 100% of sugar beets are GMO, and I think that's herbicide. It's for herbicide resistance too. So if you're eating something that has sugar beets in it, you're eating GMO. Let's see, potatoes. So the picture here shows the two different potatoes and its resistance to bruising and browning. There's also some GMO potatoes that resist insect pests and disease. Papayas, a lot of those are GMO, and they've been modified to be resistant to a certain virus that pretty much like wiped out all the papayas in Hawaii, and so the GMO crop or GMO modification has saved the Hawaiian papaya industry also. So yeah. All right. Other important contributions, military readiness. So the picture on the left is military MREs. So MRE stands for meal ready to eat. And so military needs something that is completely non-perishable, that doesn't have to be refrigerated at all, but that they can make and serve nutritious meals out in the field. And so that was developed for them. But coming out of that, we actually have consumer products that have been developed. A lot of it's kind of directed towards like backpackers that are, going to go out for, a long time and need something that they can just pull out of their backpack and heat and eat. And so these three products on the right are some of those that came out of the concept of MREs that food scientists developed and then adapted to something that the general public would like. Another example is space food. Tang was a big early space food. The background behind Tang is that there wasn't really any agreement between like NASA and the company that made Tang to bring it out into space or anything, but they needed something because the water that the astronauts were drinking tasted awful. It was basically like the system that contained the water, there was some chemical reaction that was happening that it just made the water taste gross, and so they mixed the Tang in with their water to improve the flavor. But other space food, of course, we have to think about not only the physics of space and how things float, and you don't want crumbs everywhere, so things have to be bite-sized if they are crummy, but also the safety. You don't want an astronaut to have a foodborne illness in space. That would be really, really, really bad. So a lot of food science innovations have been done with space food that are concerning food safety and have then been transferred to general public food safety. HACCP is one of them. Also food analog. So a food analog is something that replaces a food. So natural or manufactured substances used in place of food or food components. Okay, that's the official definition from the book. Okay, so some examples of food analogs. Starting on the left here, we have the light low-fat chips. So they replaced the fat with Olestra. Turned out that was actually a bad idea, and we'll talk about that when we get to that chapter on lipids. So you don't really see those anymore, but it was an analog for fat. Very more commonly today, we see meat analog. So on the left, you have a black bean burger. On the right, you have the Impossible Burger. So both of those are plant-based meat, which is not meat. Then moving all the way to the right, we have sugar analogs. So the top is monk fruit. So a sweetener that has no calories, and then like on the bottom you have all these other sweeteners that are on the market that are sugar substitutes. And then on the bottom we have salt substitutes. So you have new salt, which is a salt substitute that it's still salt. It's calcium, or sorry, not calcium, potassium chloride salt instead of sodium chloride. But it has no sodium for people who are needing to avoid sodium. And like Mrs. Dash is just really an herb blend that can kind of be used for some people in place of salt because it adds enough flavor, so they're not needing to add the salt. Okay. So one more set of important contributions would be processing technologies. Freeze drying is a really good one. On the top left, we have freeze dried tomatoes and raspberries. And that definitely extends shelf life on those quite a bit. Blanching is a processing technology that we will learn about in this course. And so it preserves the green color of frozen vegetables. The next picture next to blanching is of high pressure processing. That's something I'll talk about way later in the year, but it's how a lot of your juice, individually like packaged juice containers, are pasteurized. Specifically like naked drinks. If you've ever had some of those, they definitely, or Boathouse, they use that. It's a great pasteurization technique that does not destroy flavors in the way that heat pasteurization can do. Robotics. So the two pictures on the right, one of those is like using robots to put sandwich crackers together, and then another one to cut cheesecake. The picture in the middle bottom is of cryogenic liquids, cryogenic freezing, which it talks about in the book. So you have liquid nitrogen, which is really, really cold, negative 194 degrees Celsius or negative 317 degrees Fahrenheit. And it makes these items freeze super, super, super fast because it is so, so cold. And so you don't get ice crystals that can damage the cellular structure of your vegetables or whatever else you're freezing. And so it maintains the quality better versus a slower freezing technique. And then finally on the bottom left, there's food irradiation, which is not used a ton today, but there are some things that are irradiated. And so the picture here showing an example of strawberries after irradiation and 15 days of storage. You can see the irradiation pretty much killed all of the mold spores, and so you don't have mold growing on the irradiated strawberries. Okay, global food trade. So key thing about this earth is like all the countries develop their own food standards, and that can be really confusing. And countries have different ideas of what's important. So in the midst of that, the Codex Alimentarius, which is Latin for food code, it gives a common language that countries can use to kind of have the same standard that they recognize. So it's developed by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, or FAO, and the World Health Organization, or WHO. And it's a set of international food standards, guidelines, codes of practice. So basically, so countries can speak the same language. Like, we will accept things that follow this standard. It's voluntary, it's not regulatory, so like there's really no way that the UN can say everyone must produce food to this standard, this safety standard, because they don't have that authority. But the countries that are part of the World Trade Organization do follow the Codex Alimentarius, and many countries do adopt them. And so this is the closest thing that we have to a global standard across food trade. And it's a big deal because there's trade wars that happen over food, and even the U.S., like, we've banned certain foods from certain countries because we don't believe that they have safety standards, and some people have banned food from our country for the same reason. And so it really does affect trade. Okay, so last slide here. My goals for this class for you. So my first major goal for you is to be a better consumer. So I want to teach you how to look at your food and understand better what has gone into it, and how you can do your research on it. Um, and so I want you to learn to ask questions about food. Don't just trust the narratives on either way. Don't just trust me on some things. I have my own biases. But realizing that anybody who's telling you anything does have a bias. Um, I can, you will at some point probably hear my spiel on nitrite. A lot of people think nitrites are bad, and there's all this push for nitrite free meat products. Well, there's a bias and a narrative behind there, and we'll get into it some other day. But being able to ask the questions and actually learn about the science behind the food, and not just hear it's a chemical, I can't pronounce it, it must be bad. Because there are reasons that things are added, and you may not agree with those reasons after you do the research, but you need to learn how to do that. Understanding food labels, another thing I want you to do. Being able to just, again, be a better consumer and look at your food labels. Understanding food safety. What foods are inherently safer, which are inherently more hazardous. I'll tell you, it's a lot of times it's not actually meat. And maybe that's because we have this respect of meat that we don't have for some other foods. But like spinach is it's one of the biggest recalled things. Or, gosh, this past year, cantaloupe they had recalls on all kinds of cantaloupe because it was full of salmonella. And so, better understanding of what food safety is, what foods are actually a danger versus, oh, that's actually pretty safe all the time, and learning how you can protect your family with how you handle food, because that's a big part of it is food handling, and of course be a better cook. No, I'm not. This is not a culinary class, but we are going to be cooking a lot of things, and but more importantly, like learning about ingredients. So learning why I add baking soda or baking powder to my baked goods. What is it actually doing? So understanding the chemical processes behind the things that go into the food you're cooking helps you become a better cook and be able to be more imaginative, and go outside the box more if you are wanting to experiment with things, because you understand more what different ingredients might do to your food product. So with that, that is our first week's lecture, and I look forward to seeing you at our first day of co-op soon. Bye, guys.